This is Jim Collison. We're live again at Heartland Developer Conference 2014 here in Omaha. And I'm here with Scott Prugh. And Scott, welcome back. We interviewed you last year. Appreciate you coming back.
Oh, it's awesome. I appreciate you guys having me.
So, Scott, for folks who don't know you, give us kind of that focus on you, a little bit of background on who you are,
Sure.
who you work for, what you do, those kinds of things.
Okay. So, name's Scott Prugh. I'm the chief architect at CSG International. We serve about 50 million cable subscribers in the U.S. and have major customers like Comcast, Time Warner, Dish Network. So if you get a cable bill, it is probably processed by us. So we have kind of large environments and have really been kind of working to improve flow and improve quality across a lot of our products. So one of the things I've been keenly interested in the last couple of years is how to apply DevOps and lean techniques to these large environments. So everyone hears about the Twitters of the world, Googles that are deploying thousands of times a day. We're really trying to move more and more towards that. We're probably never going to get to thousands of times per day, but we are trying to release more and more often and with less and less impact to our customers.
Sure.
And we found that a lot of these techniques are applicable across a lot of organizations and very useful.
So you say you won't get to thousands of times a day. So
Yeah.
what do you get to at this point?
Well, I think for us, one of the things, since we have a lot of major customers on the platform, they can't take things that quickly anyways.
Sure.
But traditionally, we used to release like twice a year, and we had very large impacts when we would release. And so what we've done over the last few years is put in several techniques which have allowed us to reduce our batch size and release now 4 times a year. And it's basically reduced the impact on our customers by 2/3. And then we deliver the value in half the time. So that sounds like, quote, just an easy thing to do, just reduce your batch size and get things to production faster. But there are a lot of structures, technology, a lack of automation, problems in place that actually prevent you from doing that. So there's a lot of kind of techniques that we put in.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the lean thinking, as I had mentioned, and then DevOps are really kind of two of the movements that we've built a lot of our practices on to be able to do this.
Can you talk a little bit? Have you given your session already? Is that
correct?
Okay, and so you talked through some of that already, but can you give us kind of high level some of those techniques that you're using to do that?
So what I start with is really kind of the first technique is really start by making sure that your development staff and all your operations staff is trained in lean thinking. So there's several frameworks out there for lean. We have adopted the Scaled Agile framework, or what's known as SAFe, and we've used that to train 2,200 practitioners across our organizations in the thought processes of lean. Once you've done that, then the rest of the platform of change becomes a lot easier because you've kind of built that basis for lean thinking, and a lot of the things that you do afterwards really kind of start to make sense once people adopt a lean mindset.
Sure. So don't just jump in, actually spend some time training. What's in a typical training cycle? What does that really entail? What's kind of best practices? How long? What are the best ways of doing that?
Yeah, so if you go to traditional manufacturing, when they go for lean training, they send folks away for 6 weeks. We didn't have that luxury.
Sure.
So we built our own in-house training based on top of the Scaled Agile framework that we built internal coaches, and the internal coaches then work with the teams, and they basically go through a day-long lean thinking training, and then there's an additional 2-day training that really builds on top of that. And then with that basis is then how we go about putting all these other changes in place that improve the flow.
So kind of train the trainer.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
And I know a lot of folks deploy that kind of methodology, and it works well. So you get your folks trained. What else? What's the kind of the next step?
So after we built that lean basis, really kind of underneath everything, then we go and do a whole bunch of other things, and a lot of this transpired over several years. So one of the traditional problems in organizations is really kind of a focus around role optimization.
Okay.
And so we employed a technique which we call the inverse Taylor maneuver, which was actually built.
Sounds like a fighter pilot.
A little bit, but Taylor was a scientist who built work methods around role-specific work. And so a lot of organizations and thought processes of how you optimize were built around the Taylor principles. So one of the things you do, so traditionally you had separate QA, development, analysis and design, architecture organizations, and different ops. So the inverse Taylor maneuver goes and says, well, let's create cross-functional teams across that so those teams learn quickly, and they now optimize the entire set of concerns for delivering a product. They're just not optimizing quality.
Sure.
So by having that cross-functional team, and to quote Kevin Baer, what it does is it increases the response repertoire of the individuals on that team, and they are able to adapt much more quickly. A QA person can start to step in for an analyst, a developer can step in for a QA person now, but when those were different orgs where you were exchanging handoffs basically through documents or through binaries, there were very high failure rates and very low rates of learning, and you didn't get the improvement.
Okay.
By employing the inverse tailor maneuver, we now have cross-functional teams. When people start to understand lean and they understand that you're optimizing the whole, they start to get why you do that, right? Because we built it on the lean basis.
Sure. And as a manager, this might be a crazy question, but as a manager, do you manage those teams in the cross-functional? Do you do you have a single manager managing that team, or do they? Because in the traditional model, you had a QA manager, you had a development manager. How does the management piece of that work?
Well, that really kind of comes to kind of Agile, and this is where obviously there's tons of synergies between DevOps and Agile, right? So DevOps is really a cultural movement to optimize across many of these roles. Agile was trying to do the same thing. It was a reaction kind of waterfall, and a lot of the processes that were put in place where you create these cross-functional teams, and in Scrum you have a Scrum Master. The resources may or may not report to the Scrum Master depending on your structure, but generally all those resources do report to one manager, and you may have maybe 30 or 40 resources that make up 2 or 3 teams that are basically all cross-functional working on it, right? Okay. So you get that optimization of flow across those resources instead of just trying to optimize for quality.
Yeah, no. And can you kind of agile management in that as well, kind of tweaking it as it's going to see, hey, this management's working or this kind of management's not, and make those changes?
You do tweak it a little bit, and you tweak it depending on the product, the management staff that you have in place. As I mentioned, one of the frameworks we do follow is the Scaled Agile framework, and they're a little bit more predictive about how you do some of these things, and we generally try to follow that, but there are exceptions where we found areas where we just don't have the right roles that fit.
Yeah. Okay. So training, teams,
organization.
What else?
Yep. So then we get to a bunch of other things. Obviously, automation and using lightweight tools is key. So what we've seen in over the years is organizations adopt extremely heavyweight tools that also create fiefdoms or caste systems. So you might have a QA tool that is only used by the quality group. Well, then how does a developer step in and help do an automation, right? So there's been a huge movement in the industry, and especially with DevOps, and where you use these lightweight open source tools, and they could even be paid tools like Puppet and Chef, but they can be checked in and put in version control and that single source of control. The single source of truth for your application. Then you use that platform to provide your automation and pave your one kind of automated way to production, and you do that across a lot of teams. So at scale, we have 40 teams. We try to get them using all these shared lightweight tools to then automate in the same way to actually deploy to production with speed and quality.
How do you manage that when sometimes there is competition between teams on tools, right? I mean, where does the buck stop on some of those things? There's maybe a little bit of advice, because I know the politics enter in, and somebody wants to do this and somebody wants to use that.
It's definitely a struggle. So one, it's a struggle from a political standpoint, and second, it's a struggle from a capacity standpoint, right? So first, from the political standpoint, people want to pick tools and they want to innovate, and innovation is extremely important, right? So you don't want to quash that, but you also, at scale, every single team innovating how they're going to do deployments creates chaos, because you always have shared resources potentially downstream, or at least we do, for operations, and if they get 40 different tools, they have to learn those 40 different tools, and it's hard to make that scale. So some of this is kind of standard enterprise architecture practices. So you have we have practices in place that if you're going to choose a tool, you have to bring it to an architecture board and review it, and if we don't have one already, it's perfectly acceptable to propose a new one. Like if we didn't have a deployment tool, then team 2 in the enterprise may say, we're going to take this enterprise objective to pick a deployment tool, and then that will become our standard. And the teams agree that we're not going to pick another one just because we want to innovate. We're going to pick it because we prefer the standards. We prefer a balance of standards and innovation.
Yeah.
Hard to do.
Yeah.
And the second piece of it, but we apply a lot of diligence to making sure that we can do that. The second is capacity. So once you have a centralized group that may either one, coordinate that, or second, take over ownership of those tools, capacity becomes a problem. If I have 40 teams, one central team, they're going to get bottlenecked very quickly. So the important thing there is if you pick a tool and a platform, let's say you pick Puppet as your standard, you want to have a team that kind of manages the general, let's say, Puppet infrastructure, but they self-service enable it. In other words, you don't basically say that every single request has to be tunneled through this central team, because they're not going to be able to keep up. They create a self-service platform. If someone needs to write a new script, they write it with the standards, check it into the version control, and they help themselves instead of that central team becoming a bottleneck.
Yeah, well, and oftentimes your highest agile teams are those that are the most innovative, and they're the ones coming up with the constant churn of, hey, let's try this, and let's try this, and so it is a little, it's not as intuitive. Sometimes you have to slow those agile teams down a little bit to say, hey, we still need to maintain some standards, because agile doesn't necessarily mean the absence of standards, right?
Exactly.
Although sometimes it's taken that way. We can do anything we want. We're going to be high agile and get stuff done. So I think that's the trick, right? And what have you seen work to maintain those standards and yet have high agility?
Yeah, and that's always the balance. So again, agile in the small, if I have 2 or 3 teams, it's much easier to innovate and not have constraints. But then when you scale it up, then these types of things start to create waste at enterprise scale, because you have all these redundant costs that you need to manage and the downstream impacts. And so, as I mentioned, the kind of techniques are, educating the teams that say, look, we value your innovation, and we have a process to do that. If you basically have a gap in the tooling and want to innovate, then bring it as a group, and the architects will get together and say, look, yes, we should pick a new deployment tool, or we should pick a new object relational mapper, or we should pick a new logging framework, or whatever it is, and then someone will step up and say, I'll evaluate that. I will evaluate, and then I'll bring it back to the group and say, this is our new standard. Does everyone agree? Right? And so that's how you kind of balance, again, the innovation with also putting some, at least, constraints around it so it doesn't get out of control.
Yeah. In your role as an architect, do you have to make some of those decisions like that?
Correct.
Then?
So my role as a chief architect, I oversee a lot of this, but I have an enterprise architecture group who really is the one who runs the day-to-day on that and handles the intake, handles working with the teams to understand what the requirements are, reaches out across the other teams to make sure that they all kind of understand that, someone is looking at a new JavaScript framework, like what do we have out there, and what have teams seen already? Can we pick something that we've already used somewhere else instead of coming up with a new one?
Yeah, and then give them some incentive, I think, right? Once it's been selective, you need to dangle a little bit of a carrot, I think, sometimes to get the teams to get adoption on that. What else? What other tips do you have?
So we talked about kind of going through the training, changing team structures. One of the other things we've done, and this was actually quoted on Martin Fowler's blog. I didn't actually have a name for it. Oftentimes you have many different technologies in an organization, and you really want to standardize that. And what Melvin Conway had built a law, and it was, I believe, in 1968, called Conway's Law, which says that your organizational structure will often dictate actually what your software architecture looks like. So his example was, 4 teams working on a compiler will produce a 4-pass compiler. So oftentimes in organizations we'll have 4 teams, and they each picked a different middleware. And again, not efficient at scale, starts to become extremely wasteful. So what we'll employ, what we call now is, we've done this for years, but Martin Fowler coined the term an inverse Conway maneuver, similar to what I said in the inverse Taylor maneuver, where we'll go take those 4 teams and we'll say, look, your goal is to choose one of these 4 technologies. We'll reorganize the teams to say, look, under one leader, and say, look, your job is to standardize all 4 of these stacks as one, right? And so we change the organizational structure or basically influence the change in the organizational structure to get the architecture that we want.
Mm-hmm.
And because otherwise you've got 4 different teams that are working in silos continually to improve their technology without kind of a unified view of how they want to go.
Yeah.
So that's Inverse Conway.
Okay. All right. Well, those are some great names.
So I credit Martin Fowler for the inverse piece of it, and then adopted it for the Taylor piece also because I thought it fit very well.
Anything else in that session you want to bring out as far as?
So I think kind of when you get through a bunch of the stuff we talked about, lightweight tools we talked about, applying those at large-scale automation. One of the other things that we've seen is to basically practice every day, right? Mm-hmm. So once you got a lot of automation, it gives you the ability to practice every day. And the important thing for this optimization across is to basically allow the same teams that are going to be supporting the product in production to practice in the non-production environments.
Mm-hmm.
Often we see an anti-pattern where in non-production environments you'll have one team deploy and deploy to development, deploy to test, deploy to the non-production environments, and then they'll hand it off to a different set of teams in production. That's very similar to having 2 different sports teams, a team that practices and a team that plays in the real game.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that, you want the team that practices together to be the one that actually works in production. And so with this technique or this pattern, what we say is, look, you need the same team practicing every day. So at the end of one of our releases, by the time we release, they practiced 90 times to get into production. So we call that model the shared operations team, where this shared operation team manages all environments, whether it's development, whether it's QA, whether it's production, and they get to practice every single day with the same tools. They understand what's coming. It buffers them from kind of changes in the application, so they're not surprised. Plus, they've done it 90 times, so they're really, really good at it now by the time they get to production.
Yeah, wow.
So
interesting.
Yeah.
What kind of questions do you get? So you just presented this this morning. What kind of questions do you typically get in your session? We've been talking about bonus content for like making these kind of interviews bonus content. So what kind of questions do you get that from the audience?
Yeah, so I think some of the questions, one, how do you measure the improvements?
Great question. Yeah.
So
and
I actually kind of started with that in the online presentation, but there was a lot of questions on the details behind that. So one of our issues that we wanted to look at were 2 things: were time to market, like how long it took us to get a feature through the system, and second was, and actually probably the most important, what was the most critical at the time, was release impact or impact to the customer. So when we put one of these releases in production, originally twice a year, it was highly impactful. It took us about 10 days to work through all the impact with the customers, fix the issues, and you can imagine that it was extremely upsetting. It was extremely upsetting to us. It was extremely upsetting to the customers. It was extremely stressful on our people. So that was one of the things we really focused on. It says, let's measure that impact, and we put quantifiers around, scoring a critical incident, scoring a high, scoring a medium, scoring a low, and created a release impact score and started looking at that. And then saying, okay, if we are going to improve quality, improve flow, and then reduce batch size, what does that release impact look like? And I kind of mentioned in the beginning, we've seen a 66% improvement in the impact. In other words, it's 66% less. It took us 10 days, usually to recover. Now it's 2. And then the severity of what occurs in production is basically about 1/3 of what it used to be.
Okay.
2 days, releases in there, the customers are like, wow, that was actually not very impactful. Our release center is like, wow, that was not very stressful. They're almost kind of like, well, did you put it in? They're starting to get the point.
Are you sure that was the right thing?
Yeah. But where we're headed now in those measurements is we now want to improve it almost an order of magnitude more. So we'd like to now reduce it so that it really truly is a non-issue. And one is you make the overall kind of quality better and get more practice. And then the second thing is I think we're going to push to try to reduce the batch size more.
Yeah.
So instead of doing 4 times a year, maybe push to 6 times a year. And that starts to move towards the, hey, these the big guys, the unicorns in like a Google, like a Twitter, deploy thousands of times a day. We'll never quite get there. That's more of kind of a stretch vision.
Yeah. Or do you need to?
Or do we need to?
Yeah.
But we also, our customers can't consume it that fast.
Sure.
Probably 6 times a year is where we may get to, where that's about as fast as they can consume. We have some teams doing once a month, and the feedback from our customers is too fast.
Okay. Can you give me an example just of like a feature that if someone on the outside looking in for the end user, that when you're talking about adding this change into the system, what does that actually mean for the end user? What are they doing differently, or what's different for them?
So kind of like business value, or what the user is using.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have a lot of applications that we have a desktop application that serves over 100,000 call center reps. So we may have a feature to simplify the selling process, right? And that may be add a wizard-based flow to that feature, right? That obviously requires front-end changes to the desktop. It requires middleware changes to the applications in between. It requires database changes. It may require other back-end system changes all the way across, right? So then what was this feature now kind of breaks out with these dependencies across all these teams. And then, of course, that entire impact of all those changes needs to be automated, tested, implemented, tested, automated for deployment and rollback, right? So we're talking really kind of about that whole value feature, what the customer sees. I want a nice, easy selling wizard. Now where all the technical changes have to go across all the systems in the back end to make that possible.
Yeah, and that would be a feature that would come out for them that would impact them.
Right, right.
New screens or a new process or a new workflow.
Yep.
Those kinds of
things. And when I turn it on, I want it to be basically rock solid, it work in all the scenarios, not create impact. All those things, again, are part of the types of impact that we're trying to reduce. And by kind of reducing batch size, again, that has been something that's key. And one of the things about reducing batch size was all the things I talked about up to, hey, now we've reduced batch size, allowed us to do that, right? So it's in many cases you can't just come in and say, well, the easy thing is just make your batch smaller. But if you have too much debt, if you don't have enough automation, if you have fragility in the system, if you have incorrect team structures, those things will prevent you from reducing batch size because you just can't go faster, right? You basically have to fix a bunch of the system components and the behaviors to then be able to reduce that batch size to then get you the smaller things that flow through the system, right? Because those smaller things create less impact when they do.
Yeah, no. We give you 45 minutes here at the conference, and so it's never enough.
No, it's not.
What do you wish, if you had a few extra minutes in the session today, what do you wish you could go back and tell them?
So I think one of the things that I do like to do is to create a lot of real-world kind of visualizations for the different examples, because some of them kind of get a little bit abstract because they talk about lean theory and batch size and I'd like to have a lot more examples, especially not just static like picture content or examples of how we use it, but kind of video examples that show really how some of these things work. I really think it helps it helps me tell the story, but I really believe it helps the audience really kind of understand it a bit better because of the abstraction at play, especially for these things at scale. It's just in a 40 or so minute presentation, you always are trying to figure out, okay, if I don't go enough breadth, I don't paint enough of the story to kind of understand how the pieces come together. But then if I don't have enough depth in each one, then the people can't quite get it. And so, there's always a trade-off between those things where I think in this case I like to go a bit deeper in some of the areas which I just don't have time to.
Yeah. Who is your typical, when you look out at the audience, do you have any idea, who are you looking at out there? Who typically comes in? So
in something like this, in DevOps and Lean, especially applying to larger organizations, you have a lot of IT professionals. You do basically management, Scrum Masters, folks who are looking to kind of improve their processes, PMO, project management groups who are looking at those things. Even up to IT director, like CIO folks who are very kind of interested in at scale how these things work. I did see I had a bunch of folks from startups and things in it, and I kind of said in the beginning that some of this stuff you may take for granted, but some of these things are extremely important to pay attention to, because many startups have started lean and agile and then kind of started to lose that as they've grown, because some of the necessities got lost. The necessities of keeping batch size small, keeping agile, having automated processes and testing. Sometimes in the chaos of growth, those things fall apart. And there are stories out there of like Etsy, for example, that kind of fell off the track and had to come back and implement a lot of these DevOps and lean techniques, right? So I leverage for them and say, look, these are important to pay attention to because they will become important to you someday.
Yeah, and you almost don't know it until it's too late.
It's too late.
You're fighting fires and you're trying to get this stuff released, and pretty soon you've gone off track.
Yep.
Somebody's got to pull you back around, right?
That's why I really think the lean thinking, you kind of go back to first principles, right, of lean, queuing theory, batch size, like a lot of those things that you try to optimize in lean really help you understand the system as it starts to get more complex. So when you start to stumble, you step back and you can look and say, okay, well, do we have too many handoffs? Do we have too many queues in the system? Is the wait time too long? Quality and defects, those are all things that your lean mindset starts to look at, right? And again, that DevOps is, of course, kind of another key kind of cultural change that really has a fundamental kind of lean component to it, and those things come together nicely to provide a nice vehicle to deliver.
Yeah, good. Well, Scott, thanks for taking a few minutes to come out. Hopefully we provided some additional content for the listeners as well, and I appreciate you just taking the time to be a part of this. We'll include some information for Scott right below the video window, so if you're watching on this just YouTube, just look directly down below you there, and there'll be some information, some metadata about him down there. And do you ever get anybody, when you do sessions like this, does anybody ever contact you afterwards to get those questions?
Definitely, yeah. All the time I get additional questions, and then folks asking for advice and stuff. So feel free to drop an email or give me a tweet. And
you bet. We'll include that. We'll include all that information down in the metadata down below. So Scott, thanks for taking a few minutes to be with us today.
Thank you.
And appreciate you watching.